Hey everyone, welcome back to part number 2 of The Great Adventure. Are you ready? I got my flannel on, so I think I'm ready. Last week we talked about preparation, and we talked about putting on the full armor of God and doing armor checks. Some of these things are going to be intertwined throughout all 3 parts, and today what I want to focus on is the adventure on the way to the adventure. Our lives and our stories all have chapters, whether you're in a later chapter writing your book or an early chapter, or you're just trying to figure out where you are in the middle somewhere in that book. But that's fine. God has us all somewhere in our story in an adventure on the way to an adventure. Can I pray for us? Before we get into this, let's go. God, thanks so much for this time. I pray that you just be with me today as I work through part number 2 of the adventure on the way to the adventure here in the Great Adventure series. God, I love each and every person out there watching. I pray that you will bless them all in some way, shape, or form. God, work through your scripture and what you would have to say to folks today. In your precious name I pray. I give all these things to you. Amen. Welcome back. So last week I started talking a little bit about what I used to do with my family for summer vacation. And we talked about preparation. We talked about putting on the armor of God. But I want to tell you just a little bit more of the story from when I was a kid. You see, we talked about preparing to go on vacation and how Toronto was like going to another planet for me as I grew up in a small little town, and I began by preparing it like all 7-year-olds do, making sure that certain toys are in the car above other toys, right? And when I look back now in my own life, and I look back at those times and how much I cherish those times, sometimes I sit back and I realize that, I thought getting to Toronto was the adventure. But really, the adventure began as soon as we left the house together as a family. You see, we began to head out on that open road. It took at least 14, 15 hours to get there, and sometimes we stayed overnight somewhere. We always went through the White Mountains, through Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. It's just beautiful through there. If you haven't been through there, you should check it out. But as a kid, I often neglect to appreciate the time spent in the car. We often think about it like you're in the back seat going, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And I'm sure I did some of that stuff for sure. But there were times going through those mountains where we'd come through a clearing and all of a sudden there was a place called Six Gun City. A few miles down the road, for all my Canadian friends that are in kilometers. I'm in America right now talking about Vermont, New Hampshire. So a few miles down the road from Six Gun City was Santa's Village. And most people out there know that I just love Christmas time from the time that I'm a kid. And to go to this almost like mini theme park that was Santa's Village, and there were little mini roller coasters and funnel cakes and all kinds of cool stuff and knickknacks and whatever. This was an adventure on the way to the adventure. And I appreciate those moments so much now, and I didn't necessarily appreciate them then, although now I look back and I go, man, that was a really cool little adventure. Let's not forget the definition of adventure. In the noun, it's an unusual and exciting, typically hazardous experience or activity. In the verb, it's to engage in hazardous and exciting activity, especially the exploration of unknown territory. Very wise scholar put it this way: it's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. He used to say, you step into the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no telling where you might be swept off to. Bilbo Baggins from The Lord of the Rings. Very wise scholar. I look at that particular scenario, being 7 and having to get ready for vacation. We laugh about, putting the things in the car and going out and being a kid. Are we there yet? But there's steps of faith there that you take as a child, don't you? You know, I didn't question my parents if they forgot to pack my swim shorts. I didn't ask them if they had thought about where we're staying. Had they booked the time off of work? Did they book the hotels? Did they have enough gas money? Were there things or activities to do along the way? I didn't ask those things. They were just, I was following along like a child in steps of faith on this adventure, on the way to Toronto to the next adventure, right? You know, Jesus even says things about steps of faith. That's what we're dealing with today in our adventure on the way to an adventure, are these little steps of faith that happen in all of our lives. And sometimes we need to have faith like a child. You know, in Matthew 18, 2 and 4, Jesus is talking here, and he says, verse 2, he called a little child to him and placed him among them, all the adults. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Faith like a child, I've heard so many pastors say. In Hebrews 11:1, now faith is the confidence in what we hope for and the assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. The ancients. Last week we talked about Noah. We talked a lot about preparation. Noah had been around for 500 years. That's some preparation for something, let me tell you. And we talked about he's an ancient to these people in the New Testament, right? And God shows up and God gives him the blueprints for the first Carnival cruise vessel. Most of the tickets are all purchased by animals. And of course, Noah and his family. I don't mean to make light of a nuclear situation that happened on the planet back then, but I can't picture, it's hard for us to picture these animals coming into the ark. It's hard for us to even picture building a boat and not knowing what rain is. We're talking about steps of faith in our adventure on the way to an adventure. And Noah has been given blueprints. He's been told to build a boat. It took him over 100 years to do it. We know that he was righteous, meaning he stood right before God and he walked faithfully with the Lord. He had bits of armor on, like we talked last week, more than bits. If you're going to build a boat like that and you're going to preach to people, imagine your neighbors walking by. Hey, Noah, what are you building there? Hey, John, I'm just building a boat. What for? It's going to rain. What's that? I don't know, but God said he's going to do it, and unfortunately a whole bunch of people are going to pass away that aren't in this boat. Carry on, Noah. Have a great day, man. I feel encouraged and lifted up talking to you. Right? Noah took steps of faith. It doesn't say anywhere in there where he asked God what rain was. It doesn't say that he questioned anything about what God wanted him to do. And he began to move in to the next adventure. What an adventure. You know, one of the things that really stands out in my mind in the whole thing about Noah, maybe it's weird, but I saw it the other day, and in Genesis 7, you should really read the story about Noah. But in chapter 7, it said, those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and the Lord, what? Closed the door behind him. Closed the door behind him. Now, was Noah and his family, were they too busy running around chasing the couple of ostriches, making sure that they got in their own pen or something like that? And they were just too busy, and the rain was falling and the waters were coming up. Maybe. But sometimes God closes a door, doesn't he, to some of the previous chapters of our lives. I just find that interesting as Noah and his family are taking these steps of faith. They've never been in a boat. They've never seen rain before. And they're taking these steps of faith, and God closed the door. You could probably do a whole sermon just on that, and I'm sure there are a bunch of them out there. Google that later, YouTube or whatever. But it says that God closed the door. Maybe you've experienced that. I know I have. Closed the door to some previous toxic relationships or toxic habits that we all had at one point, or different pieces of our life that we needed to turn the page into a new chapter. Maybe you're feeling like you need to, I feel like we all need to turn the page on this COVID chapter, if you know what I'm saying. But I find it so interesting that when taking those little steps of faith into the adventure, on the way to an adventure, let's face it, Noah's next adventure was to repopulate the earth. I mean, if that's not an adventure, I don't know what is. But God closes the door behind him. Next up was David. We talked about David last week. Now he had prepared as a shepherd boy for the different things that maybe he needed to learn in life, but he was ultimately facing the giant, is where we left it off last week, and about how David had his armor on. And much like Noah taking steps of faith, David also took steps of faith. And there was an adventure on the way to an adventure. Noah was in a boat, sailing off with his family and the animals. Super dramatic time. I mean, an unparalleled dramatic period of time. Let's be honest, all jokes aside. But David too had an adventure on the way to an adventure. What am I talking about? We all know David became king, but there was actually a 10-year span of time between the time that he had been anointed to the time that he had become king. In fact, in Samuel 16:12-15, we have the account of him being anointed. It says, so he sent for him, Jesse, and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. David is anointed the next king of Israel. But little did he know, or how would he begin to even think to know the path forward when there was already a king in place? There were some steps of faith to be had in that adventure on the way to the adventure. And sometimes, much like our definition, remember that it can be hazardous. It can be unknown territory. David had never been a king before. He didn't have classes to take to learn. He had prepared in different ways that he didn't think would become relevant and ultimately did. You see, David, when he finally meets Goliath, after that he gets taken off into Saul's court, working for the king. I'm sure that's a learning curve, right? And as things begin to progress, David has to be thinking, I was anointed to be king. How is that going to happen, God? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? How many years go by before, as Jesus said, I'm 7, I'm sitting in the back of the car. Are we there yet? Like we all do. But there were hazardous moments in that transition period, or in that adventure on the way to an adventure. In fact, David was faithful, depending on God. David was faced with the situation 2 times where he could have taken the king's life. He could have taken matters into his own hands because he was impatient. It doesn't say that David was impatient, but he had 2 opportunities where he could have taken his own power and sped things up a little bit. I know I would love to speed us up to get through this COVID thing. Would love to do that. There's been so many times in my life where I've wanted to hold the reins on what I was doing. And I would begin almost like, sitting shotgun. I envisioned sitting on a stagecoach, an old Western stagecoach, and I'm kind of sitting there and I want God to drive my life, so I give him the reins. And as we begin to progress, I think this is great, but there's times where I just go, you know what? Hey, do you think I could drive for a little bit? Can I just take those reins back? And of course, he goes, here you go. And what happens when Travie gets the reins? Chaos happens when I get the reins. And before long, we're not on a smooth track at all. And every time that happens, I'm like, you know what? I don't know what I was doing. Here you go. I need you to drive again. And it says that David had faith and he trusted that God at his appointed time would follow through on his promises. And ultimately, it took 10 years. David was running for his life at points, trying to get away from King Saul before David could be king. Talk about an adventure on the way to an adventure and taking steps of faith, keeping your armor on, protecting yourself from those fiery arrows with that shield of faith. My goodness, guys, time is escaping. I got to get on to Paul because we left Paul in such a funny place last week. This is our third and final guy. If you're joining us for part number 2 today, part number 1 was the great adventure where we talked about preparation and putting on armor for our great adventure. You can go and check that out. It's on YouTube. It lives there. This one will live there as well. Share it with your friends. Send it to somebody you think maybe needs to do an armor check, or you want them to do an armor check with you. Make sure that you're checked and you're ready for battle together as we work toward what the Lord has us working on in our own stories. But Paul, we left Paul last week. We talked about his preparation and how he grew up studying under one of the most famous rabbis and knowing the law to the point where he was actually persecuting Christians and putting them in prison, separating husbands from wives, and really wreaking just havoc back then on those that had been dedicated followers of Jesus. We talked about Paul, whose first name was Saul. His original name was Saul. And he had planned a trip to Damascus. He was actually on his way to Damascus to persecute more Christians. And they had anticipated his arrival. But something happened. There was a new chapter coming. And in Acts 9, verse 3, we're going to start. Here's what happened to Saul on his way to Damascus. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, he replied. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. Right after this, right in this next piece, Saul loses his eyesight. And he's taken into Damascus and he can't see. And that's when God talks to Ananias and he needs to go and visit Paul because he has a message for him. And Ananias says, are you crazy, God? Are you crazy? Do you know that this guy has come here to persecute Christians, people like me, and you want me to go and talk to him? That's crazy talk. But he does it. He takes a little step of faith. He heads over there, talks with Paul, and Paul's eyesight is restored, but more than that, his life is radically changed. Because he realizes he has an encounter with the Lord. In fact, it says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, he replied. And in Acts 9:29, as the story develops very, very quickly, after Paul receives his eyesight, it says, at once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. All of those who heard him were astonished and asked, isn't this the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on his name, on this name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests? Yet Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. Talk about an adventure on the way to an adventure. Oh my goodness. I mean, he hears the audible voice of God saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" And his life is flipped upside down in a matter of hours. And he begins to go to the same places where he would go to look for Christians and persecute them. He begins to go there. And it says, by proving, Saul grew more and more powerful, baffled the Jews. They're like, what is going on? And Paul is proving that Jesus is the Messiah. Imagine being in that church and your husband or your wife had been taken away because of this man, and now here he stands talking and proving that Jesus is the Messiah. I mean, what's the way forward look like? In fact, we talked about Ephesians. I'm out of time. We talked about Ephesians, putting on the full armor of God, and how this was written by Paul as he moves from one adventure to the next adventure and taking steps of faith. You want to talk about it? I mean, good grief, the guy ends up in prison so many times, just like he had put other people there, singing in prison. You really need to read the life of Paul. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to do so. But he wrote about putting on the armor, the full armor of God, not a piece of it, not a part of it. You can't just put on your shield and think that everything's going to go hunky-dory. You can't just put on your helmet. You need to have your feet solid. I'd encourage you to go back to watch part number 1. But we're talking about an adventure on the way to the adventure and taking steps of faith, you know. And much like a child, sometimes we have to place that faith, and only that faith in God, that he sees the way forward, even when we don't. You know, the book of Ephesians has got some pretty high praise out there. W.O. Carver described the book of Ephesians as the greatest piece of writing in all of history. And the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge called it the divinest composition of man. Martin Luther King said, "Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase." I'm out of time. Guys, where are you in your journey? Where are you in your great adventure? Do you need to take some little steps of faith? Do you need to make sure you check your armor? I think we all do, and I think we all need to take little steps of faith. And I just want you to leave encouraged today when you look at the life of Paul and David and Noah. Begin to read these. Maybe read ahead of me, and next week you won't even be surprised. But take a look at these guys and how they lived and how they actually put the armor on and lived out their faith. I encourage you to do that today. Find someone to check your armor for you. Let's pray today. God, thank you so much for this time together. I enjoy getting to spread the good news of the gospel, that you are a very loving God, that you are the God of second and third and fourth chances, and that we can come to you like little children. Give our lives to you, God, and begin to go on a great adventure that you designed for us, taking steps of faith. Much like the definition says that it can be hazardous, and especially going into those areas, the unknown, but you are such a good Father. I loved my father. And I know that I don't have to ask you, God, do you know the way? Did you make sure you looked at the right roadmap for my life? No, I know you did, God. I'm grateful to be your servant. I'm grateful to be able to share your word with friends and family, anyone that wants to listen. God, I pray for my brothers and sisters out there that they'll check their armor, that they'll give all of their small and large steps to you and trust that you have the best plan for them. Bring us back here next week, God, to talk about part number 3, which is the adventure after the adventure. Guys, I'll see you all next week. God bless you. Take care. Check your armor. See you next week. Bye for now.